Chapter 2. There is not in all England a town so blatantly picturesque as Tilling, nor one for the lover of level marshland, of tall reedy dykes, of enormous sunsets and rims of blue sea on the horizon, with so fortunate an environment. The hill on which it is built rises steeply from the level land, and, crowned by the great grave church so conveniently close to Miss Mapp's residence, positively consists of quaint corners, rough cast and timber cottages, and mellow Georgian fronts. Corners and quaintnesses, gems, glimpses, and bits are an obsession to the artist, and, in consequence, during the summer months, not only did the majority of its inhabitants turn out into the cobbled ways with sketching blocks, canvases, and paint-boxes, but every morning brought into the town char-a-bancs from neighbouring places loaded with passengers, many of whom joined the artistic residents, and you would have thought, until an inspection of their productions convinced you of the contrary, that some tremendous outburst of art was rivalling the Italian Renaissance. For those who were capable of tackling straight lines and the intricacies of perspective, there were the steep cobbled streets of charming and irregular architecture, while for those who rightly felt themselves colourists rather than architectural draftsmen, there was the view from the top of the hill over the marshes. There, but for one straight line to mark the horizon, and that could easily be misty, there were no petty conventionalities in the way of perspective, and the eager practitioner could almost instantly plunge into vivid greens and celestial blues, or, at sunset, into pinks and chromes and rose madder. Tourists who had no pictorial gifts would pick their way among the sketchers and search the shops for cracked china and bits of brass. Few, if any of them, left without purchasing one of the famous Tilling money-boxes, made in the shape of a pottery pig, who bore on his back that remarkable legend of his authenticity, which ran, "I won't be druv, though I am willing. Good morning, my love," said the pig of Tilling. Miss Mapp had a long shelf full of these in every colour to adorn her dining-room. The one which completed her collection, of a pleasant magenta colour, had only just been acquired. She called them my sweet rainbow of piggies, and often when she came down to breakfast, especially if Withers was in the room, she said, "Good morning, quaint little piggies." When Withers had left the room, she counted them. The corner where the street took a turn towards the church, just below the window of her garden-room, was easily the most popular stance for sketchers. You were bewildered and bowled over by bits. For the most accomplished of all, there was that rarely attempted feat, the view of the steep downward street, which, in spite of all the efforts of the artist, insisted, in the sketch, on going uphill instead. Then, next in difficulty, was the street after it had turned, running by the gardener's cottage up to the churchyard and the church. This, in spite of its difficulty, was a very favourite subject, for it included, on the right of the street, just beyond Miss Mapp's garden wall, the famous crooked chimney, which was continually copied from every point of view. The expert artist would draw it rather more crooked than it really was, in order that there might be no question that he had not drawn it crooked by accident. This sketch was usually negotiated from the 3 steps in front of Miss Mapp's front door. Opposite the church and chimney artists would sit others, drawing the front door itself difficult, and moistening their pencils at their cherry lips, while a little further down the street was another battalion hard at work at the gabled front of the garden-room and its picturesque bow. It was a favourite occupation of Miss Mapp's, when there was a decent gathering of artists outside, to pull a table right into the window of the garden-room, in full view of them, and quite unconscious of their presence, to arrange flowers there with a smiling and pensive countenance. She had other little playful public pastimes. She would get her kitten from the house and induce it to sit on the table while she diverted it with the tassel of the blind, and she would kiss it on its sweet little sooty head, or she would write letters in the window, or play patience there, and then suddenly become aware that there was no end of ladies and gentlemen looking at her. Sometimes she would come out of the house, if the steps were very full, with her own sketching paraphernalia in her hands, and say, ever so coyly, "May I scriggle through?" or ask the squatters on her own steps if they could find a little corner for her. that was so interesting for them. They would remember afterwards that just while they were engaged on their sketches, the lady of that beautiful house at the corner, who had been playing with her kitten in the window, came out to sketch too. She addressed gracious and yet humble remarks to them. "I see you are painting my sweet little home. May I look? Oh, what a lovely little sketch." Once, on a never-to-be-forgotten day, she observed one of them take a camera from his pocket and rapidly focus on her as she stood on the top step. She turned full-faced and smiling to the camera just in time to catch the click of the shutter. But then it was too late to hide her face, and perhaps the picture might appear in the graphic or the sketch, or among the posturing nymphs of a neighbouring water-place. This afternoon she was content to scriggle through the sketches, and humming a little tune, she passed up to the churchyard. Scriggle was one of her own words, highly popular. It connoted squeezing and wriggling. There she carefully concealed herself under the boughs of the weeping ash tree, directly opposite the famous south porch of the church. She had already drawn in the lines of this south porch on her sketching block, transferring there by means of a tracing from a photograph, so that formed a very promising beginning to her sketch. But she was nicely placed, not only with regard to her sketch, for, by peeping through the pretty foliage of the tree, she could command the front door of Mrs. Poppet's, M.B.E., house. Miss Mapp's plans for the bridge party had, of course, been completely upset by the encounter with Irene in the High Street. Up till that moment she had imagined that, with the two ladies of the house, and the Bartletts, and the Major, and the Captain, and Godiva, and herself, 2 complete tables of bridge would be formed, and she had, therefore, determined that she would not be able to squeeze the party into her numerous engagements, thereby spoiling the second table. But now everything was changed. There were 8 without her, and unless at 3:45 she saw reason to suppose, by noting the arrivals at the house, that 3 bridge tables were in contemplation, she had made up her mind to squeeze it in, so that there would be 9 gamblers, and Isabel or her mother, if they had any sense of hospitality to their guests, would be compelled to sit out for ever and ever. Miss Mapp had been urgently invited. Sweet Isabel had made a great point of squeezing it in, and if Sweet Isabel, in order to be certain of a company of 8, had asked quaint Irene as well, it would serve her right. An additional reason, besides this piece of good nature in managing to squeeze it in, for the sake of Sweet Isabel, lay in the fact that she would be able to take some red currant fool, and after 1 spoonful exclaim, "Delicious," and leave the rest uneaten. The white butterflies and the swallows were still enjoying themselves in the sunshine, and so, too, were the gnats, about whose pleasure, especially when they settled on her face, Miss Mapp did not care so much. But soon she quite ceased to regard them, for, before the quaint little gilded boys on each side of the clock above the north porch had hammered out the 3/4 after 3 on their bells, visitors began to arrive at the Poppets' door, and Miss Mapp was very active, looking through the boughs of the weeping ash, and sitting down again to smile and ponder over her sketch, with her head a little on one side, if anybody approached. One by one the expected guests presented themselves, and were admitted. Major Flint and Captain Puffin, the Padre and his wife, darling Diva with her head muffled in a cloud, and finally Irene, still dressed as she had been in the morning, and probably reeking with scarlet fever. With the 2 Poppets, these made 8 players, so as soon as Irene had gone in, Miss Mapp hastily put her sketching things away, and holding her admirably accurate drawing, with its wash of sky not quite dry, in her hand, hurried to the door, for it would never do to arrive after the 2 tables had started, since in that case it would be she who would have to sit out. Boone opened the door to her 3 staccato little knocks, and sulkily consulted his list. She duly appeared on it, and was admitted. Having banged the door behind her, he crushed the list up in his hand and threw it into the fireplace. All those whose presence was desired had arrived, and Boone would turn his bovine eye on any subsequent caller, and say that his mistress was out. "And may I put my sketching things down here, please, Boone?" said Miss Mapp ingratiatingly. "And no one will touch my drawing. It's a little wet still, the church porch." Boone made a grunting noise like the tilling pig and slouched away in front of her down the passage leading to the garden, sniffing. There they were, with the 2 bridge tables set out in a shady corner of the lawn, and a buffet vulgarly heaped with all sorts of dainty confections, which made Miss Mapp's mouth water, obliging her to swallow rapidly once or twice before she could manage a wide, dry smile. Isabel advanced. "D'ye do, dear?" said Miss Mapp. "Such a rush, but managed to squeeze it in, as you wouldn't let me off." "Oh, that was nice of you, Miss Mapp," said Isabel. A wild and awful surmise seized Miss Mapp. "And your dear mother?" she said. "Where is Mrs. Poppet?" "Mamma had to go to town this morning. She won't be back till close on dinner time." Miss Mapp's smile closed up like a furled umbrella. The trap had snapped behind her. It was impossible now to scriggle away. She had completed instead of spoiling the second table. "So we're just 8, said Isabel, poking at her, so to speak, through the wires. "Shall we have a rubber first, and then some tea? Or tea first? What says everybody?" Restless and hungry murmurs, like those heard at the sea lion's enclosure in the zoological gardens when feeding time approaches, seemed to indicate tea first, and with gallant greetings from the Major, and archaistic welcomes from the Padre, Miss Mapp headed the general drifting movement towards the buffet. There may have been tea there, but there was certainly iced coffee and lager beer, and large jugs with dew on the outside and vegetables floating in a bubbling liquid in the inside, and it was all so vulgar and opulent that with one accord everyone set to work in earnest, in order that the garden should present a less gross and greedy appearance. But there was no sign at present of the red-currant fool, which was baffling. "And have you had a good game of golf, Major?" asked Miss Mapp, making the best of these miserable circumstances. "Such a lovely day. The white butterflies were enjoying—" She became aware that Diva and the Padre, who had already heard about the white butterflies, were in her immediate neighbourhood, and broke off. "Which of you beat? Or should I say won?" she asked. Major Flint's long moustache was dripping with lager beer, and he made a dexterous sucking movement. "Well, the Army and the Navy had it out," he said. "And if for once Britain's Navy was not invincible, eh, Puffin?" Captain Puffin limped away, pretending not to hear, and took his heaped plate and brimming glass in the direction of Irene. "But I'm sure Captain Puffin played quite beautifully, too," said Miss Mapp, in the vain attempt to detain him. She liked to collect all the men around her, and then scold them for not talking to the other ladies. "Well, a game's a game," said the Major. "It gets through the hours, Miss Mapp. Yes, we finished at the 14th hole and hurried back to more congenial society. And what have you done today? Fairy errands, I'll be bound. Titania, ha?" Suet errands and errands about a missing article of underclothing were really the most important things that Miss Mapp had done today, now that her bridge party scheme had so miscarried. But naturally she would not allude to these. "A little gardening," she said, "a little sketching, a little singing. Not time to change my frock and put on something less shabby, but I wouldn't have kept sweet Isabel's bridge party waiting for anything, and so I came straight from my painting here. Padre, I've been trying to draw the lovely south porch, but so difficult. I shall give up trying to draw, and just enjoy myself with looking. And there's your dear Evie. How do you do, Evie, love?" Godiva Plasto had taken off her cloud for purposes of mastication, but wound it tightly round her head again as soon as she had eaten as much as she could manage. This had to be done on one side of her mouth, or with the front teeth in the nibbling manner of a rabbit. Everybody, of course, by now knew that she had had a wisdom tooth out at 1 p.m. with gas, and she could allude to it without explanation. "Dreamed I was playing bridge," she said, "and had a hand of aces. As I played the first, it went off in my hand, all over, blood. Hope it'll come true. Bar the blood." Miss Mapp found herself soon afterwards partnered with Major Flint and opposed by Irene and the Padre. They had hardly begun to consider their first hands when Boone staggered out into the garden under the weight of a large wooden bucket, packed with ice, that surrounded an interior cylinder. "Red-currant fool, at last," thought Miss Mapp, adding aloud, "Oh, poor little me, is it to declare, shall I say, no trumps?" "Mustn't consult your partner, Mapp," said Irene, puffing the end of her cigarette out of its holder. Irene was painfully literal. "I don't, darling," said Miss Mapp, beginning to fizz a little. "No trumps. Not a trump. Not any sort of trump. There. What are we playing for, by the way?" "Bob 100, said the Padre, forgetting to be either Scotch or archaic. "Oh, gambler. You want the poor box to be the rich box, Padre," said Miss Mapp, surveying her magnificent hand with the greatest satisfaction. If it had not contained so many court cards, she would have proposed playing for sixpence, not a shilling 100. All semblance of manners was invariably thrown to the winds by the ladies of Tilling when once bridge began. Primeval hatred took their place. The winners of any hand were exasperatingly condescending to the losers, and the losers correspondingly bitter and tremulous. Miss Mapp failed to get her contract, as her partner's contribution to success consisted of more 2s and 3s than were ever seen together before, and when quaint Irene at the end said, "Bad luck, Mapp," Miss Mapp's hands trembled so much with passion that she with difficulty marked the score. But she could command her voice sufficiently to say, "Lovely of you to be so sympathetic, dear." Irene, in answer, gave a short, hoarse laugh and dealed. By this time, Boone had deposited at the left hand of each player a cup containing a red creamy fluid, on the surface of which bubbled intermittently appeared. Isabel, at this moment being dummy, had strolled across from the other table to see that everybody was comfortable and provided with sustenance in times of stress, and here was clearly the proper opportunity for Miss Mapp to take a spoonful of this attempt at red-currant fool, and with a wry face, hastily, but not too hastily, covered in smiles, to push the revolting compound away from her. But the one spoonful that she took was so delicious and exhilarating that she was positively unable to be good for Isabel. Instead, she drank her cup to the dregs in an absent manner, while considering how many trumps were out. The red-currant fool made a similarly agreeable impression on Major Flint. "'Pon my word," he said, "that's amazingly good. Cooling on a hot day like this, full of champagne." Miss Mapp, seeing that it was so popular, had of course to claim it again as a family invention. "No, dear Major," she said, "there's no champagne in it. It's my Grandmamma Mapp's famous red-currant fool, with a little additions by me. No champagne, yolk of egg and a little cream. Dear Isabel has got it very nearly right." The Padre had promised to take more tricks in diamonds than he had the slightest chance of doing. His mental worry communicated itself to his voice. "And why should there be nary a wee drappy of champagne in it?" he said, "though your Grandmamma Mapp did invent it. Well, let's see your hand, partner. That's a sair sight." "And there'll be a sair wee score of Guinness when you're through with the playing o' it," said Irene, in tones that could not be acquitted of a mocking intent. "Why the hell, hallelujah, did you go on when I didn't support you?" Even that one glass of red-currant fool, though there was no champagne in it, had produced, together with the certainty that her opponent had overbidden his hand, a pleasant exhilaration in Miss Mapp. But yolk of egg, as everybody knew, was a strong stimulant. Suddenly the name red-currant fool seemed very amusing to her. "Red-currant fool," she said. "What a quaint old-fashioned name. I shall invent others. I shall tell my cook to make some gooseberry idiot or strawberry donkey. My play, I think, a ducky little ace of spades." "Ha! Gooseberry idiot," said her partner. "Capital. You won't beat that in a hurry. And a 2 of spades on the top of it." "You wouldn't expect to find a 2 of spades at the bottom of it," said the Padre, with singular acidity. The Major was quick to resent this kind of comment from a man, cloth or no cloth. "Well, by your leave, Bartlett, by your leave, I repeat," he said. "I shall expect to find 2s of spades precisely where I please, and when I want your criticism." Miss Mapp hastily intervened. "And after my wee ace, a little king piece," she said. "And if my partner doesn't play the queen to it, delicious. And I play just one more, yes, lovely. Partner puts wee trumpy on it. I'm not surprised. It takes more than that to surprise me. And then Padre's got another spade, I ken fine." "Hoot!" said the Padre with temperate disgust. The hand proceeded for a round or two in silence, during which, by winks and gestures to Boone, the Major got hold of another cupful of red-currant fool. There was already a heavy penalty of tricks against Miss Mapp's opponents, and after a moment's refreshment, the Major led a club, of which, at this period, Miss Mapp seemed to have none. She felt happier than she had been ever since, trying to spoil Isabel's second table, she had only succeeded in completing it. "Little Trumpy again," she said, putting it on with the lightness of one of the white butterflies, and turning the trick. "Useful little Trumpy." She broke off suddenly from the chant of victory which ladies of Tilling were accustomed to indulge in during cross ruffs, for she discovered in her hand another more than useless little clubby. The silence that succeeded became tense in quality. Miss Mapp knew she had revoked, and squeezed her brains to think how she could possibly dispose of the card, while there was a certain calmness about the Padre, which but too clearly indicated that he was quite content to wait for the inevitable disclosure. This came at the last trick, and though Miss Mapp made one forlorn attempt to thrust the horrible little clubby underneath the other cards and gather them up, the Padre pounced on it. "What ho, fair lady," he said, now completely restored. "Methinks thou art forsworn. Let me have a look at that last trick but 3. Verily I wis that thou didst trump ye club aforetime. I said so. There it is. That's bonny for us, partner." Miss Mapp, of course, denied it all, and a ruthless reconstruction of the tricks took place. The Major, still busy with red-currant fool, was the last to grasp the disaster, and then instantly deplored the unsportsmanlike greed of his adversaries. "Well, I should have thought in a friendly game like this," he said. "Of course you are within your right, Bartlett. Might is right, eh? But upon my word, a pound of flesh, you know. Can't think what made you do it, partner." "You never asked me if I had any more clubs," said Miss Mapp shrilly, giving up for the moment the contention that she had not revoked. "I always ask if my partner has no more of a suit, and I always maintain that a revoke is more the partner's fault than the player's. Of course, if our adversaries claim it—" "Naturally we do, Mapp," said Irene. "You were down on me sharp enough the other day." Miss Mapp wrinkled her face up into the sweetest and extremest smile of which her mobile features were capable. "Darling, you won't mind me telling you that just at this moment you are being dummy," she said, "and so you mustn't speak a single word. Otherwise there is no revoke, even if there was at all, which I consider far from proved yet." There was no further proof possible beyond the clear and final evidence of the cards, and since everybody, including Miss Mapp herself, was perfectly aware that she had revoked, their opponents merely marked up the penalty and the game proceeded. Miss Mapp, of course, following the rule of correct behaviour after revoking, stiffened into a state of offended dignity, and was extremely polite and distant with partner and adversaries alike. This demeanour became even more majestic when, in the next hand, the Major led out of turn. The moment he had done it, Miss Mapp hurriedly threw a random card out of her hand on the table, in the hope that Irene, by some strange aberration, would think she had led first. "Wait a second," said she. "I call a lead. Give me a trump, please." Suddenly, the awful expression as of some outraged empress faded from Miss Mapp's face, and she gave a little shriek of laughter, which sounded like a squeaking slate pencil. "Haven't got one, dear," she said. "Now may I have your permission to lead what I think best?" "Thank you." There now existed between the 4 players that state of violent animosity which was the usual atmosphere towards the end of a rubber. But it would have been a capital mistake to suppose that they were not all enjoying themselves immensely. Emotion is the salt of life, and here was no end of salt. Everyone was overbidding his hand, and the penalty tricks were a glorious cause of vituperation, scarcely veiled, between the partners who had failed to make good, and caused epidemics of condescending sympathy from the adversaries, which produced a passion in the losers far keener than their fury at having lost. What made the concluding stages of this contest the more exciting was that an evening breeze suddenly arising just as a deal was ended made the cards rise in the air like a covey of partridges. They were recaptured, and all the hands were found to be complete with the exception of Miss Mapp's, which had a card missing. This, an ace of hearts, was discovered by the padre, face upwards, in a bed of mignonette, and he was vehement in claiming a fresh deal on the grounds that the card was exposed. Miss Mapp could not speak at all in answer to this preposterous claim. She could only smile at him, and proceeded to declare trumps as if nothing had happened. The Major alone failed to come up to the full measure of these enjoyments, for though all the rest of them were as angry with him as they were with each other, he remained in a most indecorous state of good humour, drinking thirstily of the red-currant fool, and when he was dummy, quite failing to mind whether Miss Mapp got her contract or not. Captain Puffin, at the other table, seemed to be behaving with the same impropriety, for the sound of his shrill falsetto laugh was as regular as his visits to the bucket of red-currant fool. What if there was champagne in it after all? So Miss Mapp luridly conjectured. What if this unseemly good humour was due to incipient intoxication? She took a little more of that delicious decoction herself. It was unanimously determined, when the two rubbers came to an end almost simultaneously, that, as everything was so pleasant and agreeable, there should be no fresh sorting of the players. Besides, the second table was only playing stakes of 6pence 100, and it would be very awkward and unsettling that anyone should play these moderate points in one rubber, and those high ones the next. But at this point, Miss Mapp's table was obliged to endure a pause, for the padre had to hurry away just before 6 to administer the rite of baptism in the church which was so conveniently close. The Major afforded a good deal of amusement, as soon as he was out of hearing, by hoping that he would not baptize the child the Knave of Hearts, if it was a boy, or, if a girl, the Queen of Spades. But in order to spare the susceptibilities of Mrs. Bartlett, this admirable joke was not communicated to the next table, but enjoyed privately. The author of it, however, made a note in his mind to tell it to Captain Puffin, in the hopes that it would cause him to forget his ruinous half-crown defeat at golf this morning. Quite as agreeable was the arrival of a fresh supply of red-currant fool, and as this had been heralded a few minutes before by a loud pop from the butler's pantry, which looked on to the lawn, Miss Mapp began to waver in her belief that there was no champagne in it, particularly as it would not have suited the theory by which she accounted for the Major's unwonted good humour, and her suggestion that the pop they had all heard so clearly was the opening of a bottle of stone ginger beer was not delivered with conviction. To make sure, however, she took one more sip of the new supply, and, irradiated with smiles, made a great concession. "I believe I was wrong," she said. "There is something in it beyond yolk of egg and cream. Oh, there's Boone. He will tell us." She made a seductive face at Boone, and beckoned to him. "Boone, will you think it very inquisitive of me," she asked archly, "if I ask you whether you have put a teeny drop of champagne into this delicious red-currant fool?" "A bottle and a half, miss," said Boone morosely, "and half a pint of old brandy. Will you have some more, miss?" Miss Mapp curbed her indignation at this vulgar squandering of precious liquids, so characteristic of poppets. She gave a shrill little laugh. "Oh, no, thank you, Boone," she said. "I mustn't have any more. Delicious, though." Major Flint let Boone fill up his cup while he was not looking. "And we owe this to your grandmother, Miss Mapp?" he asked gallantly. "At a second debt." Miss Mapp acknowledged this polite subtlety with reservation. "But not the champagne in it, Major," she said. "Grandmamma Knapp—" The Major beat his thigh in ecstasy. "Ha! That's a good spoonerism for Miss Isabel's book," he said. "Miss Isabel, we've got a new—" Miss Mapp was very much puzzled at this slight confusion in her speech, for her utterance was usually remarkably distinct. There might be some little joke made at her expense on the effect of Grandmamma Mapp's invention, but if she, who had only just tasted the red-currant fool, tripped in her speech, how amply were Major Flint's good nature and Captain Puffin's incessant laugh accounted for. She herself felt very good-natured too. How pleasant it all was. "Oh, naughty," she said to the Major. "Pray, hush, you're disturbing them at their rubber. And here's the padre back again." The new rubber had only just begun. Indeed, it was lucky that they cut their cards without any delay, when Mrs. Poppet appeared on her return from her expedition to London. Miss Mapp begged her to take her hand, and instantly began playing. "It would really be a kindness to me, Mrs. Poppet," she said. "No diamonds at all, partner. But of course, if you won't, you've been missing such a lovely party. So much enjoyment." Suddenly she saw that Mrs. Poppet was wearing on her ample breast a small piece of ribbon with a little cross attached to it. Her entire stock of good humour vanished, and she smiled her widest. "We needn't ask what took you to London," she said. "Congratulations. How was the dear king?" This rubber was soon over, and even as they were adding up the score, there arose a shrill outcry from the next table, where Mrs. Plastow, as usual, had made the tale of her winnings 6pence in excess of what anybody else considered was due to her. The sound of that was so familiar that nobody looked up or asked what was going on. "Darling Diva and her baubles, Padre," said Miss Mapp in an aside, so modest in her demands. Oh, she stopped. Somebody has given her 6pence. "Not another rubber? Well, perhaps it is rather late, and I must say good night to my flowers before they close up for the night." "All those shillings mine? Fancy!" Miss Mapp was seething with excitement, curiosity, and rage, as, with Major Flint on one side of her and Captain Puffin on the other, she was escorted home. The excitement was due to her winnings, the rage to Mrs. Poppet's order, and curiosity to the clue she believed she had found to those inexplicable lights that burned so late in the houses of her companions. Certainly it seemed that Major Flint was trying not to step on the joints of the paving-stones, and succeeding very imperfectly, while Captain Puffin, on her left, was walking very unevenly on the cobbles. Even making due allowance for the difficulty of walking evenly there at any time, Miss Mapp could not help thinking that a teetotaler would have made a better job of it than that. Both gentlemen talked at once, very agreeably, but rather carefully, Major Flint promising himself a studious evening over some very interesting entries in his Indian diary, while Captain Puffin anticipated the speedy solution of that problem about the Roman road which had puzzled him so long. As they said their au reservoirs to her on her doorstep, they took off their hats more often than politeness really demanded. Once in her house, Miss Mapp postponed her good nights to her sweet flowers, and hurried with the utmost speed of which she was capable to her garden room, in order to see what her companions were doing. They were standing in the middle of the street, and Major Flint, with gesticulating forefinger, was being very impressive over something. Interesting as was Miss Mapp's walk home, and painful as was the light which it had conceivably thrown on the problem that had baffled her for so long, she might have been even more acutely disgusted had she lingered on with the rest of the bridge party in Mrs. Poppet's garden, so revolting was the sycophantic loyalty of the newly decorated member of the British Empire. She described minutely her arrival at the palace, her momentary nervousness as she entered the throne-room, the instantaneousness with which all that vanished when she came face to face with her sovereign. "I assure you, he gave the most gracious smile," she said, "just as if we had known each other all our lives, and I felt at home at once. And he said a few words to me. Such a beautiful voice he has. Dear Isabel, I wish you had been there to hear it. And then—" "Oh, mamma, what did he say?" asked Isabel, to the great relief of Mrs. Plastow and the Bartletts, for while they were bursting with eagerness to know with the utmost detail all that had taken place, the correct attitude in Tilling was profound indifference to anybody of whatever degree who did not live at Tilling, and to anything that did not happen there. In particular, any manifestation of interest in kings or other distinguished people was held to be a very miserable failing. So they all pretended to look about them, and take no notice of what Mrs. Poppet was saying, and you might have heard a pin drop. Diva silently and hastily unwound her cloud from over her ears, risking catching cold in the hole where her tooth had been, so terrified was she of missing a single syllable. "Well, it was very gratifying," said Mrs. Poppet. "He whispered to some gentleman standing near him, whom I think was the Lord Chamberlain, and then told me how interested he had been in the good work of the Tilling Hospital, and how especially glad he was to be able, and just then he began to pin my order on, to be able to recognise it. Now I call that wonderful, to know all about the Tilling Hospital. And such neat, quick fingers he has. I am sure it would take me double the time to make a safety pin hold. and then he gave me another smile and passed me on, so to speak, to the Queen, who stood next to him, and who had been listening to all he had said. "And did she speak to you too?" asked Diver, quite unable to maintain the right indifference. "Indeed she did," she said, "so pleased. And what she put into those 2 words I'm sure I can never convey to you. I could hear how sincere they were. It was no set form of words, as if she meant nothing by it. She was pleased. She was just as interested in what I had done for the Tilling Hospital as the King was. And the crowds outside, they lined the Mall for at least 50 yards. I was bowing and smiling on this side and that till I felt quite dizzy." "And was the Prince of Wales there?" asked Diver, beginning to wind her head up again. She did not care about the crowds. "No, he wasn't there," said Mrs. Poppit, determined to have no embroidery in her story, however much other people, especially Miss Mapp, decorated remarkable incidents till you hardly recognised them. "He wasn't there. I dare say something had unexpectedly detained him, though I shouldn't wonder if, before long, we all saw him. For I noticed in the evening paper, which I was reading on the way down here, after I had seen the King, that he was going to stay with Lord Ardingly for this very next weekend. And what's the station for Ardingly Park, if it isn't Tilling? Though it's quite a private visit, I feel convinced that the right and proper thing for me to do is to be at the station, or at any rate just outside, with my order on. I shall not claim acquaintance with him, or anything of that kind," said Mrs. Poppit, fingering her order. "But after my reception today at the palace, nothing can be more likely than that His Majesty might mention, quite casually of course, to the Prince, that he had just given a decoration to Mrs. Poppit of Tilling, and it would make me feel very awkward to think that that had happened, and I was not somewhere about to make my curtsy." "Oh, mamma, may I stand by you, or behind you?" said Isabel, completely dazzled by the splendour of this prospect and prancing about the lawn. This was quite awful. It was as bad as, if not worse than, the historically disastrous remark about super tax, and a general rigidity, as of some partial cataleptic seizure, froze Mrs. Poppit's guests, rendering them like incomplete Marconi installations capable of receiving, but not of transmitting. They received these impressions. They also continued, mechanically, to receive more chocolates and sandwiches, and such refreshments as remained on the buffet, but no one could intervene and stop Mrs. Poppit from exposing herself further. One reason for this, of course, as already indicated, was that they all longed for her to expose herself as much as she possibly could, for if there was a quality, and indeed there were many, on which Tilling prided itself, it was on its immunity from snobbishness. There were, no doubt, in the great world with which Tilling concerned itself so little, kings and queens and dukes and members of the Order of the British Empire, but every Tillingite knew that he or she, particularly she, was just as good as any of them, and indeed better, being more fortunate than they in living in Tilling. And if there was a process in the world which Tilling detested, it was being patronised. And there was this woman telling them all what she felt it right and proper for her, as Mrs. Poppit of Tilling, M.B.E., to do, when the heir apparent should pass through the town on Saturday. The rest of them, Mrs. Poppit implied, might do what they liked, for they did not matter, but she must put on her order and make her curtsy. And Isabel, by her expressed desire to stand beside or even behind her mother for this degrading moment, had showed of what stock she came. Mrs. Poppit had nothing more to say on this subject. Indeed, as Diver reflected, there was really nothing more that could be said, unless she suggested that they should all bow and curtsy to her for the future, and their hostess proceeded, as they all took their leave, to hope that they had enjoyed the bridge party which she had been unavoidably prevented from attending. "But my absence made it possible to include Miss Mapp," she said. "I should not have liked poor Miss Mapp to feel left out. I am always glad to give Miss Mapp pleasure. I hope she won her rubber. She does not like losing. Will no one have a little more red currant fool? Boone has made it very tolerably today. A Scotch recipe of my great-grandmother's." Diver gave a little cackle of laughter as she enfolded herself in her cloud again. She had heard Miss Mapp's ironical inquiry as to how the dear King was, and had thought at the time that it was probably a pity that Miss Mapp had said that. Though abhorrence of snobbery and immunity from any taint of it was so fine a characteristic of public social life at Tilling, the expected passage of this distinguished visitor through the town on Saturday next became very speedily known, and before the wicker baskets of the ladies in their morning marketings next day were half full, there was no quarter which the news had failed to reach. Major Flint had it from Mrs. Plastow as he went down to the 11:20 tram out to the golf links, and though he had not much time to spare, for his work last night on his old diaries had caused him to breakfast unusually late that morning, to the accompaniment of a dismal headache from over-application, he had stopped to converse with Miss Mapp immediately afterwards, with one eye on the time, for naturally he could not fire off that sort of news point-blank at her, as if it was a matter of any interest or importance. "Good morning, dear lady," he said. "By Jove, what a picture of health and freshness you are." Miss Mapp cast one glance at her basket to see that the paper quite concealed that article of clothing which the perfidious laundry had found. Probably the laundry knew where it was all the time, and, in a figurative sense, of course, was trying it on. "Early to bed and early to rise, Major," she said. "I saw my sweet flowers open their eyes this morning. Such a beautiful dew." "Well, my diaries kept me up late last night," he said. "When all you fascinating ladies have withdrawn is the only time at which I can bring myself to sit down to them." "Let me recommend 6 to 8 in the morning, Major," said Miss Mapp earnestly. "Such a freshness of brain then." That seemed to be a cul-de-sac in the way of leading up to the important subject, and the Major tried another turning. "Good, well-fought game of bridge we had yesterday," he said. "Just met Mrs. Plastow. She stopped on for a chat after we had gone." "Dear Diver, she loves a good gossip," said Miss Mapp effusively. "Such an interest she has in other people's affairs, so human and sympathetic. I'm sure our dear hostess told her all about her adventures at the palace." There were only 7 minutes left before the tram started, and though this was not a perfect opening, it would have to do. Besides, the Major saw Mrs. Plastow coming energetically along the high street with whirling feet. "Yes, we haven't finished with royalty yet," he said, getting the odious word out with difficulty. "The Prince of Wales will be passing through the town on Saturday, on his way to Ardingly Park, where he is spending the Sunday." Miss Mapp was not betrayed into the smallest expression of interest. "That will be nice for him," she said. "He will catch a glimpse of our beautiful Tilling." "So he will. Well, I'm off my game of golf. Perhaps the Navy will be a bit more efficient today." "I'm sure you will both play perfectly," said Miss Mapp. Diver had popped into the grocer's. She always popped everywhere just now. She popped across to see a friend, and she popped home again. She popped into church on Sunday, and occasionally popped up to town, and Miss Mapp was beginning to feel that somebody ought to let her know, directly or by insinuation, that she popped too much. So, thinking that an opportunity might present itself now, Miss Mapp read the news board outside the stationer's till Diver popped out of the grocer's again. The headlines of news, even the largest of them, hardly reached her brain, because it was entirely absorbed in another subject. Of course, the first thing was to find out by what train. Diver trundled swiftly across the street. "Morning, Elizabeth," she said. "You left the party too early yesterday. Missed a lot. How the King smiled. How the Queen said, 'So pleased.'" "Our dear hostess would like that," said Miss Mapp pensively. "She would be so pleased too. She and the Queen would both be pleased. Quite a pair of them." "By the way, on Saturday next," began Diver. "I know, dear," said Miss Mapp. "Major Flint told me. It seemed quite to interest him. Now I must pop into the stationer's." Diver was really very obtuse. "I'm popping in there too," she said. "Want a timetable of the trains." Wild horses would not have dragged from Miss Mapp that this was precisely what she wanted. "I only wanted a little ruled paper," she said. "Why, here's dear Evie popping out just as we pop in. Good morning, sweet Evie. Lovely day again." Mrs. Bartlett thrust something into her basket which very much resembled a railway timetable. She spoke in a low, quick voice, as if afraid of being overheard, and was otherwise rather like a mouse. When she was excited, she squeaked. So good for the harvest, she said. Such an important thing to have a good harvest. I hope next Saturday will be fine. It would be a pity if we had a wet day. We were wondering, Kenneth and I, what would be the proper thing to do if he came over for service. Oh, here is Kenneth. She stopped abruptly, as if afraid that she had betrayed too much interest in next Saturday and Sunday. Kenneth would manage it much better. "Ha, Lady Fair," he exclaimed, "having a bit crack with the wee wifey. Any news this bright morning?" "No, dear Padre," said Miss Mapp, showing her gums. "At least, I've heard nothing of any interest. I can only give you the news of my garden. Such lovely new roses in bloom today, bless them." Mrs. Plastow had popped into the stationer's, so this perjury was undetected. The Padre was noted for his diplomacy. Just now he wanted to convey the impression that nothing which could happen next Saturday or Sunday could be of the smallest interest to him, whereas he had spent an almost sleepless night in wondering whether it would, in certain circumstances, be proper to make a bow at the beginning of his sermon and another at the end, whether he ought to meet the visitor at the west door, whether the mayor ought to be told, and whether there ought to be special psalms. "Well, Lady Fair," he said, "gossip will have it that ye Prince of Wales is staying at Ardingly for the Sunday. Indeed he will, I suppose, pass through Tilling on Saturday afternoon." Miss Mapp put her forefinger to her forehead, as if trying to recollect something. "Yes, now somebody did tell me that," she said. "Major Flint, I believe. But when you asked for news, I thought you meant something that really interested me. Yes, Padre?" "I will, if he comes to service on Sunday. Dear Padre, I'm sure he'll hear a very good sermon." "Oh, I see what you mean. Whether you ought to have any special hymn. Don't ask poor little me. Mrs. Poppet, I'm sure, would tell you. She knows all about courts and etiquette." Diva popped out of the stationer's at this moment. "Sold out," she announced. "Everybody wanted timetables this morning. Evie got the last. Have to go to the station." "I'll walk with you, Diva, dear," said Miss Mapp. "There's a parcel that... Goodbye, dear Evie. Au reservoir." She kissed her hand to Mrs. Bartlett, leaving a smile behind it as it fluttered away from her face for the Padre. Miss Mapp was so impenetrably wrapped in thought as she worked among her sweet flowers that afternoon that she merely stared at a love in a mist, which she had absently rooted up instead of a piece of groundsel, without any bleeding of the heart for one of her sweet flowers. There were 2 trains by which he might arrive, one at 4:15, which would get him to Ardingly for tea, the other at 6:45. She was quite determined to see him, but more inflexible than that resolve was the Euclidean postulate that no one in Tilling should think she had taken any deliberate step to do so. For the present she had disarmed suspicion by the blankness of her indifference as to what might happen on Saturday or Sunday, but she herself strongly suspected that everybody else, in spite of the public attitude of Tilling to such subjects, was determined to see him too. How to see and not be seen was the question which engrossed her, and though she might possibly happen to be at that sharp corner outside the station where every motor had to go slow on the arrival of the 4:15, it would never do to risk being seen there again at precisely 6:45. Mrs. Poppet, shameless in her snobbery, would no doubt be at the station with her order on at both these hours if the arrival did not take place by the first train, and Isabel would be prancing by or behind her. And, in fact, dreadful though it was to contemplate, all Tilling, she reluctantly believed, would be hanging about. Then an idea struck her, so glorious that she put the uprooted love in a mist in the weed basket instead of planting it again, and went quickly indoors, up to the attics, and from there really popped, so tight was the fit, through a trapdoor onto the roof. Yes, the station was plainly visible, and if the 4:15 was the favoured train, there would certainly be a motor from Ardingly Park waiting there in good time for its arrival. From the house roof she could ascertain that, and she would then have time to trip down the hill and get to her coal merchants at that sharp corner outside the station and ask rather peremptorily when the coke for her central heating might be expected. It was due now, and though it would be unfortunate if it arrived before Saturday, it was quite easy to smile away her peremptory manner and say that Withers had not told her. Miss Mapp hated prevarication, but a major force sometimes came along. But if no motors from Ardingly Park were in waiting for the 4:15, as she spied from her house roof, she need not risk being seen in the neighbourhood of the station, but would again make observations some few minutes before the 6:45 was due. There was positively no other train by which he could come. The next day or two saw no traceable developments in the situation, but Miss Mapp's trained sense told her that there was underground work of some kind going on. She seemed to hear faint hollow taps and muffled knockings, and, so to speak, the silence of some unusual pregnancy. Up and down the High Street she observed short, whispered conversations going on between her friends, which broke off on her approach. This only confirmed her view that these secret colloquies were connected with Saturday afternoon, for it was not to be expected that, after her freezing reception of the news, any projected snobbishness should be confided to her, and though she would have liked to know what Diva and Irene and darling Evie were meaning to do, the fact that they none of them told her showed that they were aware that she, at any rate, was utterly indifferent to and above that sort of thing. She suspected, too, that Major Flint had fallen victim to this untilling-like mania, for on Friday afternoon, when passing his door, which happened to be standing open, she quite distinctly saw him in front of his glass in the hall, standing on the head of one of the tigers to secure a better view of himself, trying on a silk-top hat. Her own errand at this moment was to the draper's, where she bought a quantity of pretty pale blue braid for a little domestic dressmaking which was in arrears, and some riband of the same tint. At this clever and unusual hour for shopping, the High Street was naturally empty, and, after a little hesitation and many anxious glances to right and left, she plunged into the toy shop and bought a pleasant little Union Jack with a short stick attached to it. She told Mr. Dabnett very distinctly that it was a present for her nephew, and concealed it inside her parasol, where it lay quite flat and made no perceptible bulge. At 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, she remembered that the damp had come in through her bedroom ceiling in a storm last winter, and told Withers she was going to have a look to see if any tiles were loose. In order to ascertain this for certain, she took up through the trapdoor a pair of binocular glasses, through which it was also easy to identify anybody who might be in the open yard outside the station. Even as she looked, Mrs. Poppet and Isabel crossed the yard into the waiting-room and ticket office. It was a little surprising that there were not more friends in the station yard, but at the moment she heard a loud "Quay-hi" in the street below, and cautiously peering over the parapet, she got an admirable view of the Major in a frock coat and tall hat. A "Coo-ee" answered him, and Captain Puffin, in a new suit, Miss Mapp was certain of it, and a Panama hat, joined him. They went down the street and turned the corner. Across the opening to the High Street there shot the figure of darling Diva. While waiting for them to appear again in the station yard, Miss Mapp looked to see what vehicles were standing there. It was already 10 minutes past 4, and the Ardingly motors must have been there by this time if there was anything doing by the 4:15. But positively the only vehicle there was an open trolley laden with a piano in a sack. Apart from knowing all about that piano, for Mrs. Poppet had talked about little else than her new upright Blutner before her visit to Buckingham Palace, a moment's reflection convinced Miss Mapp that this was a very unlikely mode of conveyance for any guest. She watched for a few moments more, but as no other friends appeared in the station yard, she concluded that they were hanging about the street somewhere, poor things, and decided not to make inquiries about her coke just yet. She had tea while she arranged flowers in the very front of the window in her garden room, and presently had the satisfaction of seeing many of the baffled loyalists trudging home. There was no need to do more than smile and tap the window and kiss her hand. They all knew that she had been busy with her flowers, and that she knew what they had been busy about. Out again they all came towards 6:30, and when she had watched the last of them down the hill, she hurried back to the roof again, to make a final inspection of the loose tiles through her binoculars. Brief but exciting was that inspection, for opposite the entrance to the station was drawn up a motor. So clear was the air, and so serviceable her binoculars, that she could distinguish the vulgar coronet on the panels, and as she looked, Mrs. Poppet and Isabel hurried across the station yard. It was then but the work of a moment to slip on the dust cloak trimmed with blue braid, adjust the hat with the little blue riband, and take up the parasol with its furled Union Jack inside it. The stick of the flag was uppermost. She could whip it out in a moment. Miss Mapp had calculated her appearance to a nicety. Just as she got to the sharp corner opposite the station, where all cars slowed down and her coal merchant's office was situated, the train drew up. By the gates into the yard were standing the Major in his top hat, the Captain in his Panama, Irene in a civilized skirt, Diver in a brand-new walking dress, and the Padre and wee wifey. They were all looking in the direction of the station, and Miss Mapp stepped into the coal merchant's unobserved. Oddly enough, the coke had been sent 3 days before, and there was no need for peremptoriness. "So good of you, Mr. Wotton," she said. "And why is everyone standing about this afternoon?" Mr. Wotton explained the reason of this, and Miss Mapp, grasping her parasol, went out again as the car left the station. There were too many dear friends about, she decided, to use the Union Jack, and having seen what she wanted to, she determined to slip quietly away again. Already the Major's hat was in his hand, and he was bowing low. So too were Captain Puffin and the Padre, while Irene, Diver, and Evie were making little ducking movements. Miss Mapp was determined, when it came to her turn, to show them, as she happened to be on the spot, what a proper curtsy was. The car came opposite her, and she curtsied so low that recovery was impossible, and she sat down in the road. Her parasol flew out of her hand, and out of her parasol flew the Union Jack. She saw a young man looking out of the window, dressed in khaki, grinning broadly, but not, so she thought, graciously, and it suddenly struck her that there was something, beside her own part in the affair, which was not as it should be. As he put his head in again, there was loud laughter from the inside of the car. Mr. Wotton helped her up, and the entire assembly of her friends crowded round her, hoping she was not hurt. "No, dear Major, dear Padre, not at all, thanks," she said. "So stupid. My ankle turned. Oh, yes, the Union Jack I bought for my nephew. It's his birthday tomorrow. Thank you. I just came to see about my coke. Of course, I thought the Prince had arrived when you all went down to meet the 4:15. Fancy my running straight into it all. How well he looked." This was all rather lame, and Miss Mapp hailed Mrs. Poppet's appearance from the station as a welcome diversion. Mrs. Poppet was looking vexed. "I hope you saw him well, Mrs. Poppet," said Miss Mapp, "after meeting 2 trains and taking all that trouble." "Saw who?" said Mrs. Poppet, with a deplorable lack both of manner and grammar. "Why," light seemed to break on her odious countenance, "why, you don't think that was the Prince, do you, Miss Mapp? He arrived here at 1, so the station master has just told me, and has been playing golf all afternoon." The Major looked at the Captain, and the Captain at the Major. It was months and months since they had missed their Saturday afternoon's golf. "It was the Prince of Wales who looked out of that car window," said Miss Mapp firmly. "Such a pleasant smile, I should know it anywhere." "The young man who got into the car at this station was no more the Prince of Wales than you are," said Mrs. Poppet shrilly. I was close to him as he came out. I curtsied to him before I saw." Miss Mapp instantly changed her attack. She could hardly hold her smile on her face for rage. "How very awkward for you," she said. "What a laugh they will have over it this evening. Delicious." Mrs. Poppet's face suddenly took on an expression of the tenderest solicitude. "I hope, Miss Mapp, you didn't jar yourself when you sat down in the road just now," she said. "Not at all, thank you so much," said Miss Mapp, hearing her heart beat in her throat. If she had had a naval 15-inch gun handy and had known how to fire it, she would, with a sense of duty accomplished, have discharged it point-blank at the order of the member of the British Empire, and at anybody else who might be within range. Sunday, of course, with all the opportunities of that day, still remained, and the seats of the auxiliary choir, which were advantageously situated, had never been so full, But as it was all no use, the Major and Captain Puffin left during the sermon to catch the 12:20 tram out to the links. On this delightful day it was but natural that the pleasant walk there across the march was very popular, and golfers that afternoon had a very trying and nervous time, for the ladies of Tilling kept bobbing up from behind sand dunes and bunkers as, regardless of the players, they executed swift flank marches in all directions. Miss Mapp returned exhausted about tea-time to hear from Withers that the Prince had spent an hour or more rambling about the town, and had stopped quite 5 minutes at the corner by the garden room. He had actually sat down on Miss Mapp's steps and smoked a cigarette. She wondered if the end of the cigarette was there still. It was hateful to have cigarette ends defiling the steps to her front door, and often before now, when sketches were numerous, she had sent her housemaid out to remove these untidy relics. She searched for it, but was obliged to come to the reluctant conclusion that there was nothing to remove.